here with Dr. Lori Chekal, who's an environmental scientist. Lori, welcome.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So much for being here. Can you explain the long-term environmental impacts of toxic spills?
Certainly. So the short answer is there is no way. And once we put toxic chemicals into the environment, they are going to be there in some form or fashion unless we can do some type of remediation. And unfortunately, a lot of times we don't know that there has been a spill or a contamination event until we either see massive die-off in the environment or humans start getting sick. Now, of course, if we have a major catastrophe like we saw on February 3rd in East Palestine, Ohio, that's a little bit of a different story. We know immediately, because there's a massive explosion, that there's potential for environmental damage. So as devastating as events like that are, they're almost better, if you will, than some of the other environmental spills that have gone largely unnoticed.
I want to go back to something you said, that once toxic spills occur, they're sort of in the environment forever. I feel like many people would think that with all of these, multi-million-dollar cleanup efforts that we get it all out of the environment. Is that not the case?
So the short answer to that is no. Sorry. And part of that is sort of cutting hairs or splicing hairs, however you want to think about it. But if you think about Love Canal, which was one of the earlier contaminated sites in New York, or closer to home and closer to Suffolk here, the MWRA, the Massachusetts Water Resource Authority, still tests the water wells that were contaminated in Woburn, Massachusetts in the 70s, and they still find those contaminants to this day in 2023. Now, they're found at what the MWRA considers safe levels. So to say, when I say these things are likely in the environment forever, I do stand by that statement. They might be at a level that the government has determined is not going to do you any harm, but they're still there. And over time, they could build up. Now, part of that is because of the Comprehensive Environmental Resource Compensation and Liability Act. I know that's a mouthful, but it's more commonly known as the Superfund Act. And I think that's probably a term more people have heard of. Think about, Aaron Brockovich, right? So Superfund sites all over the country. So that law came in 1980. And that was really, I know it seems like a short time ago, but that was the point at which the government stepped in and said, it doesn't matter who owns it, whoever polluted it is in charge of paying for the cleanup. But the issue that a lot of environmentalists have with that Superfund Act is that to appease businesses, not 100% of the area has to be cleaned up. And the reason for that is economic. So let's say I have Lori's Leathers and I spill dioxins, which is one of the most common things. And it's going to cost me, for easy math, $100 to get 95% of those dioxins cleaned up. But it's going to cost me $1,000 just to get that last 5%. And so the cost benefit analysis is such that depending on which toxin it is, there's going to be that small percentage that the EPA says, okay, that low level can stay. So a lot of times these things are cleaned up, and really what we're doing is taking contaminated soil and bringing it to a hazardous landfill and then hoping that there's no breach at the hazardous landfill. So it's still in the, we haven't done anything but contain it. So it's still there. And then if you get a break, a failure in your hazardous landfill, which can happen, not very often in this country, thankfully, but then you've got a leak. So we basically are just moving the waste. In many cases, there are remediation efforts that will break it down. But in many cases, once that chemical is in the soil, the air, the water, what have you, our best case scenario, if we can't fully, truly remediate it and break it down into its less toxic components, is to store it away.
That's alarming for so many reasons. The fact that companies don't have to clean up all of it, they could legally leave a percentage, is terrible. And moving it to a different place, I mean, I guess we don't have another solution, but that's also not really a solution.
It's definitely not a solution. And I feel I would be remiss if I didn't point out that most of these are disproportionately near public housing projects and adjacent to tribal lands.
Ties back to a whole environmental justice episode we did.
Yeah.
In terms of regulation and government oversight, what types of changes can be made to improve these types of situations?
They put together the Railway Safety Act of 2023. It hasn't been approved yet, but they do have some very interesting supporters, including Marco Rubio, who isn't always on, historically has not always been on the side of environmental or workers' rights, I would say. Both of the senators from Pennsylvania, which also shouldn't be that surprising because East Palestine, Ohio, if you're not familiar with your geography of that part of the country, is not too far away from Pennsylvania, and the way the river flows, anything that happened in East Palestine is going to have an impact potentially on Pennsylvania. And then Senator Hawley from Montana was also supportive of this, which there's a lot of railway activity that actually comes down from Canada. They just had a rollover over the weekend of hazardous material, but nothing leaked. That's why you didn't hear about it on the news. So train derailments are pretty common and are a huge risk when it comes to these hazardous materials getting into the environment, just because it's one of the most concentrated ways we move it around. So when something goes wrong, it goes very wrong. Other issues that made train derailments and the hazardous spills from them more likely was a rollback from this previous administration. So the Trump administration rolled back an Obama era ruling that said all trains carrying hazardous material had to have upgraded electronic braking systems. That was rolled back during the Trump administration, and the brakes on many of the trains that carry hazardous material across this country every single day have what has been described as Civil War era hydraulic brakes. And that's frightening, but also explains why there's roughly 3 train derailments a day in this country. And last year there were over 1,100. The concerning thing, now it's always a concern, right? Even if it's a community, but the concerning thing is that the trains that carry people, we're seeing a decline in derailments. So that's great from a immediate, loss of life. That's terrible. Die in a train crash. Nobody wants that. However, we are seeing an increase in the amount of train derailments with trains carrying toxic materials or hazardous materials. because of these shortcuts in safety measures, the rollback that I just mentioned. And so even though those would be addressed in this Railway Safety Act of 2023, we haven't seen immediate action at all.
I've also heard that not just the brakes, but the length of the trains has been getting bigger and bigger. So coupled with brakes that don't really work, when you have a 2-mile long train, it's going to have a hard time stopping.
It is absolutely going to have, I'm glad you mentioned that the 2-mile trains, because I was going to bring that up as well. The 2-mile trains are a pretty big problem when you have hydraulic brakes, because when the hydraulic braking mechanism, even when it's functioning properly, it sort of has an accordion effect. So imagine a 2-mile long accordion that's come off its tracks because it's too hot, essentially overheated, which is what happened in East Palestine. They determined that, they got too hot, overheated, sparks were flying, brakes failed, accordion effect.
Part of what they did to mitigate the spill was this controlled burn of the chemicals. Can you talk about that and explain that procedure maybe?
5 of the cars had vinyl chloride gas, which is extremely volatile. And when they realized that they were leaking, they did a controlled burn, as you mentioned, and the reason for that is to prevent an explosion. So it's sort of like when you dig a fire line and you make a fire break, it's to prevent the forest fire from reaching your town, right? So this was a quote unquote slow burn. So they burned off the vinyl chloride so it did not cause an explosion.
If vinyl chloride or other compounds have gotten into the water systems, especially the groundwater, how does that get cleaned? Is there a way?
So there is a way. So there's a way to clean the water, there's a way to clean the soil, there's a way to clean the air. Essentially, if it gets into the groundwater has to be pumped out. So essentially you're depleting the aquifer, which is going to supply water not only for humans, but it's also going to deplete the groundwater for all of the vegetation in the area, which then of course is just going to have an effect. If there's less water, then all the vegetation is going to suffer. That's the base of the food chain, and it goes on from there. But again, do you want to have basically drought condition or contaminated water? So the water gets removed, it gets pumped out of the ground, and it gets cleaned. And the Department of Defense does a lot of research on this, and they found that so mushroom remediation is quite effective for dioxins. So I was kind of surprised that wasn't used in this area. Maybe it's such a large amount that they didn't deem it was necessary. Also could have been the wrong time of year. I don't know how many mushrooms are going to be growing in Ohio in February, but it's certainly something that can be done on site depending on the toxins. So I think we're going to see more bioremediation only because, as I said earlier, there's more and more chemicals that can be spilled. I mean, chemistry is awesome, right? So we just have to fight chemistry with more chemistry, or biology in this case. After Chernobyl, they used sunflowers because they are hyperaccumulators of cesium and strontium. So they pull up the radioactive material out of the ground. But to my point earlier, once it's here, right? You can't eat those sunflower seeds. They're not going to make you, break any batting records. So those sunflowers then have to be harvested and put in a hazardous landfill. So it's more about containment. We're not really getting rid of any of it. We're just managing where we keep it.
And moving it to a less impactful area. talking a little bit about water and contaminated groundwater spills. I know that your family was affected by the toxic spills and contaminated water wells in Woburn. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So in the 1960s and the 1970s, there was a company called W.R. Grace, and they did different types of manufacturing. Woburn was known for tanning. That's their high school mascot, and for shoemaking. And so a lot of the chemicals in those processes were dumped into the waterways. And this was common practice. So at that time, unfortunately, I mean, we thought, let me see if I can get this one right. It is late enough in the day. Dilution is the pollution solution, right? That was just how it was done. But what we're realizing is that is not actually true. Yeah, so Ann Anderson was a mom in Woburn in the 70s and realized there are way too many kids getting leukemia in this town. This is not random chance. And what they found was there were 2 wells in close proximity to the W.R. Grace site, and they were contaminated. And so the kids unfortunately got sick. 8 families were in the class action lawsuit. However, it came out afterwards that there were many more kids that got sick. Their families decided not to be in it. And actually, one of the plaintiffs' husband passed away from adult form or acute myeloid leukemia after everything had been settled. So it wasn't just the kids. And sort of that's where my family comes in. My father owned a site work company in the early 80s. And he was literally digging in and around the Abidjona River. So all of the soil, if people were getting in-ground pools or septic systems or home foundations. So he's literally, digging the trench, so in the trenches of that contaminated waste. And he got a very rare form of leukemia, not the same type as the parent that I referenced earlier. And so he died 10 months after he was diagnosed. And then every single one of his employees also got sick. And 2 of them are still alive today. Originally, I thought I was going to be an oncologist, but then I thought that might actually just be treating the symptom and not the actual problem, which of course is dilution is not the pollution solution. We need to stop putting these things into the ground.
And that's what drove you to be an environmental scientist?
I think probably, yeah. But the MWRA is still out there testing. And I think that's something that when we see these sensational stories of devastation like we saw in East Palestine, they are just getting started. I mean, what happened in Woburn was 40 years ago, and they're still monitoring it to this day. So East Palestine is in for a long haul. Think about Silent Spring, right? All of a sudden, these things bioaccumulate through the ecosystem. So even though we think it's at this very low level in the watershed, all of the little critters that live in it are going to accumulate it in their tissues. And then when it gets to the apex predators or to humans, we have serious problems on our hands.
It's the same story with microplastics and fish eating microplastics and then accumulating them, and then we end up eating plastic.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
The same story in different forms.
As a country, I think hyper-focused on climate change as a result of burning fossil fuels, but there are so many other issues and pollutants associated with fossil fuels that I think we lose sight of just how damaging they are.
I find it really funny that a lot of the conversations I have on this show always cycle back to climate change and And it's just such a big problem. And the more you dig into it, the more you see that all of these issues are interconnected on such a deep level that it's almost hard to separate them and almost hard to find a solution that solves every aspect of it. It's like we have to chip away at it at a small level and move our way up.
Yes, chipping away at it is the only way. It's to try to fix it wholesale, as great as I was mentioning earlier, the Railroad Safety Act is going to be. Yes, that's needed for a whole host of reasons, but that's just chipping away at one part of it. Why do we need to transport these chemicals from, where were they going, from Texas to New Jersey? The ones that ended up all over East Palestine. So if we didn't have such a, here we go, if we didn't have such a consumeristic society where we wanted so many things, we wouldn't need so many chemicals. I mean, half of all of the Christmas presents that were bought last year, and I'm sure it's the same for all the other religions, but I only have the stat for Christmas. Half of all of the Christmas presents that were bought this year will be in a landfill, or were bought for 2022 will be in a landfill by the end of this month. They say 6 months, the average life expectancy of a Christmas gift. But I have to have it.
I think we'll wind down on that bombshell. Is there anything that we didn't touch on that you would like to add or comment on?
Walk when you can.
Lori, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great being part of this discussion.
See you next time on Science on the Street.